Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I've actually got one of the 7 videos from my free coaching course. So this course is an overview of some of the key principles and ideas that I think is really important to understand as a coach, allied health, anyone that deals with movement and coaching in any capacity and pushing performance and helping others do that. I've created a free coaching course. It's got 7 20-minute, roughly 20-minute videos, and this is one of them where we unpack this idea of stability, what it is and what it isn't, because I think it's completely misunderstood. I also think it's a narrative in the performance world that doesn't need to be there. I think it confuses clients. I think it confuses coaches. And ultimately, I think it is nocebic, meaning that it creates more negative-based outcomes of ideas around training that can really harm clients and athletes long term, believing that joint stability is somehow this very fluid, dynamic sort of trainable outcome, which it just isn't. So if you do enjoy this video, I'd highly recommend jumping into the free course. It's linked down below. It's called Think Deeper, and hopefully I'll see you in there. Let's unpack some of these ideas and actually think a little bit deeper about what is actually going on. So a lot of people, in the industry and a lot of models of movement put these two things on a continuum, that stability and mobility are somehow connected. So let's try to define them. Stability is often, that's the true definition. It's the ability to strength or withstand or endure. There is a balance consideration within biomechanical understandings of stability, and that is simply just the ability to maintain balance. So you can perturb, you can push a system and it reacts and returns back to its equilibrium space. That is all related to center of mass and base of support. But ultimately, when most people, and this is where I think of stability and I think it breaks down, most people think of stability as somehow living within this controlled movement expression, and that any motion away from what we would deem to be optimal would be an unstable, or there's a joint that's been pulled by a muscle or any of those sort of things, which hopefully now with the tension response, you know that that's just not actually what's going on. But that's kind of the idea of stability, that it's this controlled movement. Then we have mobility, which is pretty straightforward. It's simply just the ability to express motion or move freely or open range and express range of motion. Then we get to this other idea, which is stiffness, which is what I actually think this continuum is. It's mobility and stiffness, but stiffness is fixed or rigid or resistant to movement. So if mobility is free movement, stiffness makes sense as being the opposite of that. So I don't think stability lives over here, but let's follow along this idea that somehow movement and the expression of movement is where stability lives. So to understand that, we need to understand what actually influences joint motion or joint movement. And there's 3 main factors that change the expression of motion at different joints in the body. The first and the biggest rock is going to be the formation of the joint itself, the osseous or the bone formation, the type of joint and how it is structured. That's your first biggest rock. The shoulder is going to function completely different to the knee, just by nature of their structure. Structure dictates the function. It's true across the board. We have then passive restraint. So there's passive things that aren't active, part of the tension response, that control and resist movement. So these are things like ligaments, meniscus, labrum, fluid, adipose tissue, skin, vascular, neural pathways. All of this passive stuff that is around joints and resists joints controls some of the forces that are going into the joint. Then we have active restraints, and active restraints become part of this understanding of active tension, but ultimately it's just muscles and the central nervous system processes to control and produce forces via the muscles. And we now know that it's not always active tension. It's sometimes passive tension, but the tension response is always reactive to everything else that's going on. And these processes of active restraints or active control processes of movement in space, they are conscious and they are subconscious. And they are driven via muscular tension. Not just contraction, tension. Some examples of joint formation. So here we've got the backside of an ankle. This is called the talocrural joint. So where the talus sort of connects in with the calcaneus here and the tibia and the fibula here. This is the typical joint that most people think about when they think of the ankle joint. And what we're actually looking at here is how the tibia kind of wraps around the talus and the fibula, and they kind of like create what is called a mortise position, a mortise joint. What we see here though is that if the talus was to drop medially, so this is the heel, if the talus was to drop this way, it would probably take the tibia with it, just by nature of the structure of that joint. Compare that to the hip and the ball and socket joint of the hip. What we're actually looking at here is a lot of free available motion because of the structure. It can move independent. The pelvis can move on the femur and the femur can move on the pelvis, or they can move together in an orientational shift, or they can move relative to each other and rotate and roll and slide and glide against each other. Just an example of two different joints and how they would actually change the expression of movement. Then we also have the SI joint, which is this flat bone joint here between the base of the spine or the sacrum into the pelvis or the ilium, and we compare that to the scapulothoracic joint here. What we know to be true around the SI joint is it's the connection of the appendicular skeleton to the axial skeleton. So there's a lot of considerations for how the forces are changing between the trunk and the extremities here. However, there's not much range of motion because of the structure and because of the amount of force that goes through there and the reactive process of the evolutionary strategy to tighten up and stiffen up this area of the body. Compare that to the scapulothoracic joint that's generally open chain, which means we're going to have a way greater amount of motion available and requirement to control that motion through active restraints. But what we see at the scapulothoracic joint, which is also the connection of the appendicular skeleton to the axial skeleton, is that we have way more available free range of motion. And the scapula can move around the rib cage, and the rib cage can move around the scapula significantly more than this SI joint. And it's a response to the evolutionary process that has dealt with forces, compressive forces on the system. This is a closed chain system that's in contact with the ground and ground reaction forces more often than not. This is an open chain expression that the hand is free moving and there's a lot more motion and all of that sort of stuff. What you'll see at the lower body to the upper body, the lower body has stiffer joints as a response to the ground reaction forces and less range of motion compared to all of the analogous joints of the upper body. They are more free moving and more available motion. They are more mobile in the upper body. They are stiffer in the lower body. That is where that continuum really starts to make sense and fall apart as stability and mobility. If we think of passive restraints, we can look at ligaments. So ligaments are of the hip and the ankle. They are kind of resisting end range of motion of the joint. So when a joint has moved so far towards its end range, the system has some tensile strategies, the ligaments, that can control and resist and decelerate that motion at end ranges. And that's ultimately what the passive restraints do. They decelerate the motion as a joint tries to open in space towards your end ranges. And anybody that has damaged the lateral ligaments of the ankle knows what happens when we reduce the integrity of those passive restraints. All of a sudden, proprioception can drop, our awareness of where we are in space, because there are receptors within the joint themselves that tell and provide information, subconscious information of where the joints are in space and the reactive processes that need to happen to deal with forces and produce forces, to deal with ground reaction forces or uneven grounds and all of those sort of things. But anyone that's damaged any passive structures know that it changes the integrity of the stiffness of the joint, and it becomes more lax. It becomes more mobile if we lose some of these structures around the joint. When we think of active restraints, we're talking about the muscular tension via the central nervous system. However, it's not always a conscious control of the muscular system. It's subconscious, it's reactive, and there's a shit ton of reflexes that manage joint positions and forces of the muscular system. A lot of it is subconscious. There's also a conscious override that we can add as coaches and movement professionals that we can teach our clients of somatic muscular tension. So consciously controlled muscular tension to achieve the task that is layered on top of the subconscious stuff. We add the task on top of the underlying systemic management strategy of forces. It's a really important thing to grasp, is that we are overriding it with a conscious control. However, the system will often revert back to the subconscious processes because it probably knows more than what we know because we don't have all the information. The central nervous system is dealing with all of the information. And ultimately, this lives within the understanding and the known truth of the nervous system. So when we look at the peripheral nervous system, which is the motor neurons and the sensory neurons, this is this interaction happening. Sensory information is brought into the system via a number of different receptors around the body. A lot of them are dealing with tension and compressive forces of the joints and the muscles and all of those sort of things. There's light, audible, touch, feel, all of those sort of things. Chemoreceptors, so the chemical and the hormonal responses within the system as well influence it. All of these sensory input is coming into the system. And then there's a motor expression that happens on the other side. And that motor expression can be both conscious and subconscious. And again, the subconscious stuff is what's happening behind the scenes that's just keeping us alive and dealing with the forces and the processes that is actually happening. And all of that subconscious stuff is entwined within the autonomic nervous system that is fight or flight and rest and digest, as well as processes that deal with the tension responses of muscles and joint positions and all of that sort of stuff. So on top of that subconscious sensory information that's processed, we then layer on the somatic conscious stuff on top of that. And it is the end of the continuum in which we override. There's so much reactive processes that's happening that's dealing with the forces. And this is ultimately where movement technique lives, is that it's a conscious process that's layered on top of this subconscious world. So what is actually happening when we coach people is it's a motor control and motor learning process that happens. So what is motor control? Motor control is the expression of movement via the sensory inputs and the motor outputs. So information comes in and we express movement and motion as a response to that. If you went back to the model way of thinking, this is the Newell's model. Inputs come in, they are processed, and we see the expression. That is what is happening within motor control. Information and sensory information comes in, it's processed by the nervous system, subconscious and consciously, and then we see the expression happen. Motor learning and the process of developing technique are the changes in the expression that occur due to progressive practice. This is what coaching is. We manage the inputs so that the system can change the way that it processes it so we can change the expression on the other side. And that is what coaching is. We manage the inputs into the system. So then ultimately, skill development is what we're probably witnessing when we see an expression of movement within the context of training. Skill development is the motor control processes being progressively challenged and directed towards efficiency. We move the system to what we believe to be the most efficient strategy, and good coaches know what that looks like. This is where we start to get to golden archetypes or perfect archetypes of movement expression, squat technique, deadlift technique, bench press technique. Most people express it very, very similar. There are going to always be outliers, but the general understanding of efficient technique is pretty much well understood now. And coaching and the process of coaching is how we progressively train and develop skill and develop the motor control processes that underpin the expressions that we're seeing. And coaches manage it via the inputs. We change the task, we change the constraints, we change the program, we change the tempo, we change all of those inputs to see and challenge the expression. And when we don't like the expression, we have to actually go back and change an input into the system. So let's go back to the first slide of this. With this understanding of how joints move and what the process of good technique development is, we now know that the stability and mobility continuum is false. It's just wrong. It's not what we're observing. It's not the truth of the matter. What is the truth is that joint mobility, the ability to express motion, is opposed by joint stiffness. And that is all a response of the structure of the joint and the muscles that coordinate and control the movement expression that's available as a response to the bone formation and the osseous, and the passive restraints of a system. So this continuum makes sense. This thing makes no sense. What we're talking about with stability is somehow within this controlled movement expression. And now that we know that the development of movement expression is a skill, and it's a motor control process of inputs being processed and expressions on the other end, let's start to shit on these narratives. Why do we blame an isolated joints expression as a stability breakdown? Movement is coordinated and it is a systemic expression. It always is. We are dealing with conscious, but more so subconscious processes of inputs into the system. It's processing that happens that then creates this reactive tension response of the soft tissues and the muscles to produce force and deal with those forces that are coming into the system. It's always systemic. Anytime we see a breakdown, we're not looking at an isolated joint. We are looking at the entire system's ability to deal with and produce forces in a reactive process. Sensory inputs create the reactive muscular tension strategy to achieve the task. It is a systemic expression to the task and the forces both applied and produced by the system. Muscular tension is a response to the entire system's requirement to achieve the task that we place on it. This position is the overriding of what we believe to be more efficient. The subconscious stuff takes over and it produces the expression, which is fine. It's good. We can learn things from this. We don't need to go and isolate that it's a hip stability problem or it's an ankle stability problem, because it's not. It's the expression as a response to the inputs. If we don't like the expression, we can change it. We can teach them a new way to express movement. But the teaching process is a systemic process. It's not an isolated process of an individual muscle in the hip. Blaming a movement breakdown on a single muscle's contribution to the expression is pointless, because it's not a single muscle. It never will be. It doesn't matter how much science and narrative around certain muscles being the overruling of certain positions. It's not true. It's a systemic expression as a response to the forces applied and produced within the system. It is a systemic breakdown of controlling and producing forces. It is not isolated to one joint and does not require an isolated process to develop. You do not need to, what you do need, is to develop the skill of movement. That's what you need. And the process to develop skill is well understood. It's called motor control and it's very easy to follow. Muscles don't fight for the position of the joint in space. It's not how the system works. The expression of any movement is never at the tug of war between a glute and an adductor, or a pec and a lat, or a rotator cuff and a pec. It's never this tug of war motion. What we're actually observing is more than likely one side of the joint is decelerating motion, and then that same muscle then contracts to re-accelerate. The glute will lengthen in the down phase. The glute max will lengthen in the down phase as the hip flexion happens, and then that lengthening tension is loaded into the system and it can then contract. It's the same muscles controlling the down phase as it is to produce the up phase. Picking out random other accessory muscles doesn't make any sense. It's a systemic expression of movement to achieve the task. This does not require any isolated hip training processes to improve. It requires the development of skill of squatting at higher loads with more efficient expression of what we want to see. It's a skill development. It's not the glute med strength. It is the system's expression to manage and produce forces. And then you get to the application of some of these stability ideas. Banded clams and side planks will never change this. This is over 200 kilos. How do we think that just doing some unloaded crap is actually going to change what happens at the highest amount of force that the system can produce? It doesn't make any sense. What you'll see is that you go and do those processes, and at submaximal loads, where the more inefficient strategy that we overrule it with can still complete the task, we see it. But as soon as we go back to high loads and high fatigue, the system goes back to the strategy that it wants to produce the most amount of force with. If you don't like the expression, teach them a new way. Just don't fucking wrap a crap narrative around a single muscle or a single position or a single joint. It's just not true. So stability is not a training outcome. I actually think we can fucking remove the word completely. What are the training outcomes? It's motor control, which we now know is skill. There's strength, increasing the force production of muscle. It's hypertrophy, which is increasing the size of the muscle. It's speed and power, which is the speed that force can be applied. It's endurance, so prolonging fatigue in the contextualization of the task. different energy systems and different processes to manage, or it's range of motion. It's one of those things that are holding us back from this. It's not an isolated joint stability process. It never will be. It can't be, because this is not a training outcome. It's, if you wanted to make a case for it, it's skill. It's the skill of movement. But the system and the systemic expression will always overrule this conscious overlay that we just place on at the end of the process of expression. So what is stability? It's actually nocebic. It's a nocebic narrative. And the reason is because if we say stability as a trainable outcome is true, the flip becomes true. And that is that the opposite is true. That a joint can become unstable throughout the process of training. That a joint's integrity can be compromised by the progressive training process. That in some way of getting stronger through the system, we have actually somehow made the hip less able to tolerate that process, which just doesn't make any sense. It's just an expression of movement. Instilling this belief that you can train for stability is nocebic. It has the potential to create a negative outcome simply due to the belief that it's true, which it's not true. It doesn't need to, the narrative doesn't need to be there. What I prefer to say when people ask about these sort of things, like as loads have increased, your technique needs to be challenged to become more efficient. Let's continue to improve your technique at these higher loads. That makes complete sense. It's very easy to understand for the client. As they're getting stronger, the demand for the technical expression goes up. We need to work on your technique more at these higher loads and high fatigue. Looks like good training to me. Compare that to, as your loads have increased, your glute med is now not firing and has caused your hips to become unstable. What we actually need to do to improve your technique is increase the stability of your hips. It just doesn't make sense. Imagine being someone that's been training for 5 years and they just decide to push their training along. And they've been training fine, no worries, they're going. Now they've got the goal to increase their strength. And as they increase their strength, they start to see some of these typical form breakdowns happen. And you as the coach start to label it as this. Certain muscles are no longer working. Certain muscles have become too strong. Certain muscles are not firing. All of these sort of things. That person is starting to download that information and move forward with their training with this idea that all of a sudden I'm becoming unstable. My hips are becoming unstable. What does that mean for other goals in my life? Is that why my pain is presenting? Is that why potentially my back feels tight? Is my back tight because my hip's unstable and it's this glute med when I squat? All of these things just stem from this shitty narrative that stability is somehow this trainable quality of movement, where it's not. The only trainable qualities of movement are these. This is the expression. Everything fits within these ideas, and this is where I think you need to continually come back to. So we don't need to blame a certain muscle. We don't need to isolate a certain muscle as the governor of stability and stabilization. It's just not true. They are systemic expressions of movement, and the development of them is skill. And when skill is challenged at high loads and high levels of fatigue, we will see some subconscious breakdown as the system begins to deal with the forces and move into the position that it needs to create the amount of force to deal with the expression and deal with the task. It is always systemic. Zoom out. And if you want to change the expression, teach them a new way. Don't blame and narratize anything. Just teach the clients a new way to lift. Thanks for making it to the end of the video. If you did make it all the way through, I appreciate you. Thank you very much. Please subscribe to the channel if you're new here, or if you're keen, check out the free course that's linked down below. Again, 7 roughly 20-minute videos unpacking the key things, the key ideas, the key principles of movement, coaching, and programming that I think are important to learn and better understand or think deeper about, regardless of if you're a personal trainer, a coach, allied health, or even just an inquisitive lifter looking to progress yourself a little further. It is linked down below. I'd love to see you in there. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.